This is my final exam presentation for wildlife conservation policy. Today I'll be talking about some recent controversies regarding the Endangered Species Act. As we know, the Endangered Species Act has been around for 50 years now, and it provides protections for species that are declining or are at risk of extinction. So over the history of this act, it has very successfully prevented the extinction of nearly every species that has been added to the list. However, naturally, there's a flip side to this, and there have been ongoing controversies with the Endangered Species Act since its inception. And a lot of these controversies hinge around the fact that these listed species have protections put on them, and that can conflict with economic development interests. So let's look at some most recent examples of this. In November of 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to increase the rank of the northern long-eared bat from its previous threatened status to endangered status based on their most recent science and evidence. Then in May of this year, Congress created a joint resolution that would disapprove the uplisting, and this opposition to the listing of this bat seemed to be primarily based on congresspersons' concerns about how protecting the bat was going to limit forestry and agricultural operations and potential road and infrastructure development as well. But then in September, President Biden vetoed the joint resolution. Then similarly with Senate Joint Resolution number 9, Congress had disapproved the listing change for the lesser prairie chicken, which has several distinct populations, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had decided to change or uplist the status for those various populations. In this case, the opposition seemed to be based on suspicions that the listing change was motivated not by the scientific obligation of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but instead it was motivated by the Biden administration's energy policy. So it so happens that the southern population of these prairie chickens occurs in western Texas and eastern New Mexico, where there's a really rich oil deposit. So listing these birds as endangered there would have prevented a lot of oil exploration in the area. And so this called into question what other motivations they thought there were for the listing. So what is my stance on all of this? Looking at the science, I skimmed through the reports that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service compiled on both of these species. It had, of course, all the studies and the data that they use in order to make a listing determination. And I side with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, looking specifically at the northern long-eared bat. These bats have been really hard hit by white nose syndrome, and almost 80% of the populations of this bat species have encountered or been affected by white nose syndrome so far. And in those affected populations, 97% of the bats are gone. So it's a pretty dire situation for them. And more broadly speaking, I think it's important to conserve bats because they provide such important ecosystem services. Similarly, with the lesser prairie chicken, they have lost a lot of habitat. About 90% of it is gone, and there's been a 97% decline in the prairie chicken population themselves. And ultimately, these birds serve as a really important indicator of the overall ecosystem health in grasslands. And as we know from the 3 billion birds paper, the study that was published, grassland habitat and grassland wildlife have been some of the hardest hit out of any ecosystem type in the United States thus far in the last half century or so. So big picture here, I think the Endangered Species Act, through these listing processes, has really effectively helped to safeguard not just the declining species, but also all the habitat and all the resources that they depend on. And so this big picture is that ESA is one of our best tools for protecting ecosystem services and keeping those intact and functional for the benefit of everyone who lives in this country. So I stand behind the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I agree with what President Biden did by vetoing those joint resolutions and safeguarding the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's decisions on these listings. So for the letter I wrote, my congressperson who's most connected to these issues is Senator Ted Budd from North Carolina. That's my neighbor state, and I've also lived and worked on conservation projects in that state before. So I'm writing to him. He was a co-sponsor for the Northern Long-Eared Bat Joint Resolution, and he serves on the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. So it seems like his co-sponsoring of Joint Resolution 24, as well as other bills that he has sponsored and co-sponsored, it seems like he's usually coming from this angle of protecting transportation and infrastructure and industry economic type interests. So in my letter, I'm hoping to make an appeal for him reconsidering his stance on the Endangered Species Act, especially as it pertains to how the Endangered Species Act can protect and safeguard the ecosystem services and all those economic benefits of intact and functional ecosystems. So I'm going to end on a brief discussion of other recent happenings with the Endangered Species Act. So under the Trump administration, 5 new rules were issued for the Endangered Species Act, some in 2019 and some in 2020. Ultimately, there was a lot of pushback from environmental groups surrounding these new rules because the rules effectively weakened the Endangered Species Act, and it certainly seemed that the rule changes were motivated from an economic standpoint, where these new rules basically allowed businesses to do more of what they want without being held in check or limited so much by the Endangered Species Act protections. Then the Biden administration, since early 2021, has been working to rescind the Trump-era Endangered Species Act changes, but officially in July of 2022, Trump's 2020 rules, those 2 rules, were rescinded, but as of right now, the 3 2019 rules still stand. And what the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service currently are planning to do is they are not completely just rescinding those rules, but instead they're reworking them to ultimately strengthen the Endangered Species Act and ensure that the ESA can fulfill all of its intended purpose, essentially. So in conclusion, the Endangered Species Act has been quite successful at protecting species from extinction. However, there have been and maybe always will be economic interests challenging the ESA. And so we've seen now some examples of the back and forth that happens within our government. And once again, this is how politics gets involved in and can be quite influential actually in our wildlife conservation policy in the United States. So thank you.